Good evening, and thank you all for coming. And so this is my mom's first cousin, and so he's a whole generation older than I am. Okay, but age-wise, I might be a little older. But anyway, his name's Danny Martin. He lives up in San Luis area, and he is the person who has drawn the weather and still drawing the weather bird for the last 40 years. And so he's here to give us a presentation on U.S. Grant and the political cartoons. And so, have at it.
Okay. Before we get started, I need a little help from the audience. Gary, can you help me just for a second? Stay right there. I need for you to ask me a question. Here's the question I want you to ask me.
Okay.
I'm going to say, Dan, how are things in the Post-Dispatch Art Department?
Dan, how are the things in the Post-Dispatch Art Department?
Sketchy, but thanks for asking. Okay, the way this lecture came about was that I met Nathan Wilson, the superintendent at Ulysses S. Grant Historical Site, Whitehaven. And I said I'd like to volunteer some time. He said, that would be great, but could we use your artistic talents? And he says, can you come up with a talk? And I said, about Grant? I said, sure. And I had spoken there about 12 years ago, just on the general history of cartooning in St. Louis, and I've written a book about that. So this is really the inaugural run on this, and you all are guinea pigs. I've never given this lecture before. This is the first time. So we're going to talk mostly about two of the biggest names in 19th century cartoonists, Thomas Nast and Joseph Kepler. Has anyone ever heard of those guys? So we'll do just a little bit of cartoon history. This is the first political cartoon ever drawn. This was found in a cave, probably 1,000 years BC. And this is the first political cartoon ever drawn in America. This is 1754. It was about how all the colonies should combine together to fight in the French and Indian War against the French. Anyone know who drew this? Ben Franklin, yeah. So this is Thomas Nast. This is the most influential, powerful cartoonist that ever lived in America. He was considered the father of political cartooning. And let me tell you something about him. Grant said he won the Civil War by the sword of Sheridan and the pencil of Thomas Nast. Lincoln said he was the Union Army's greatest recruiting soldier. And Grant said Nast has done as much as anyone to preserve the Union and bring the war to an end. It's pretty heady stuff. So he was born in Landau, Germany, came over to New York City when he was 6 years old, couldn't speak a word of English. He hated school. He was short, couldn't speak English, he was picked on. So he only lasted he quit school about 14, had a little formal training, and he was such a good artist that at 16 he got on at Leslie's newspaper, Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, all of you are probably familiar with that. And then he went to another paper and they sent him overseas. He was just an amazing innate artist with very little training, 90% self-taught. He was not one of these battle artists, did a little bit of it, but this is Alfred Wald, W-A-U-D, probably a lot of you Civil War guys know him. And he's one of the guys that were actually out on the battlefield that would do sketches, and those were sent back to Leslie's Illustrated and other newspapers, and then the engravers would do an engraving off of this in print. Mostly Nast, these large allegorical splash pages like this for Leslie's, and then Harper's Weekly. That was his home base for many years. So this was the press in the field. There's Watt up in the upper left-hand corner, I believe. And this is the War in the Border States. So these were two double-page spreads and very, very popular. And these were tremendously difficult to do, and Nast pulled it off. This one's called The Boys in Blue, and that's Grant in the front. And the lower left-hand corner is Thomas Nast sketching him in a self-portrait. And he did this beautiful painting of the surrender. And for Harper's Weekly, he did this of Grant. He adored Grant. He lived through the Civil War, and he worshipped Grant and Lincoln so much, and he realized how close it was for America to be dissolved. And this is after the Union won. A nice portrait of Grant at the very top. When Andrew Johnson was still president, overseeing, he didn't do much about the race riots in New Orleans. Here's Grant on the lower left-hand side, looking noble, wanting to do something, but he couldn't really. He was totally against Andrew Johnson. This is an original oil painting that's at his hometown museum in Morristown, New Jersey, of Lincoln and Sheridan lopping the head off of Robert E. Lee. He's also famous in the cartooning world for several things. He didn't invent Uncle Sam as a symbol, but he did sort of perfect it, popularize it. He added the goatee and long hair. He was also famous for, Tammany Hall was a political organization in New York that was corrupt and ruled all of New York City. The guy in the middle there is a fellow named Boss Tweed that was the boss of Tammany Hall, and single-handedly, Nass brought him down. In fact, Boss offered him $500,000 to go away, and Nass turned it down. And what we know is Santa Claus today, jolly old guy in a red suit coming down chimneys, this is largely due to Thomas Nast, mostly from his Bavarian upbringing. Here's Santa Claus. Now in the middle there is the Democratic donkey. So he didn't invent the donkey as a Democratic symbol, but he did make it more of a jackass than a donkey. But he did totally invent the elephant as a Republican symbol. So the first election that Grant was involved in, this was the Democratic side. This was a guy named Seymour, and the vice presidential candidate was Francis P. Blair. And all you people know him, he's a Civil War general, right? And during the campaign, it was a pretty knockdown, drag-out fight. So when we think about how nasty politics are today and how acrimonious things are with cartoonists and social media, these guys were going through it, back in the 19th century. So this is Grant against Seymour, and Nass frequently, you can tell how much he loved Grant, Nass frequently drew Seymour with these two tufts of hair up, so he's a devil. In fact, that Seymour is the devil there, with wings and cloven cloves and in a tail. So Nass didn't pull any punches. In fact, this is Seymour trying to assassinate General Grant, or the candidate Grant. In the next election that came along, that Grant was involved with, Horace Greeley and B. Gratz Brown. Does anyone remember Civil War guys, officer in the Civil War? And St. Louis, a Missourian, former governor of Missouri, I think. He's buried in Kirkwood. Unbelievably enough, he's Francis P. Blair's cousin. So Nass really, really hated Greeley. And the odd thing was, during that election, a group of Republicans called liberal Republicans, but they really weren't liberal, broke off from the proper Republican Party, from Grant. And they went in with the Democrats. The Democrats kind of went in with them. They thought that we combine forces and we'll defeat the traditional Republican Party that Grant's trying to lead. And that's Horace Greeley at the top, surrendering to all the Democrats coming over the edge. So it was kind of an odd bedfellows. And of course, all of you know about the scandals that involved in the Grant presidency, probably about 12 or so. So he wasn't completely, Pollyannish about Grant's shortcomings, but he never directly criticized him. This is just Uncle Sam trying to get to the bottom of all the scandals. But most of the time, Nass was drawing Grant as a real noble centurion, a fine Roman that could rule the empire. And this is Grant as a lion trying to guard the treasury from all the thieving politicians in Washington. This was the newspapers hailing what a great job Grant was doing. Does anyone know this guy? Civil War general, senator from Missouri, Carl Schurz, S-C-H-U-R-Z, very famous. He's one of the progressive Republicans that opposed Grant. So Nass naturally really hated his guts. In fact, that's Schurz on the far right trying to tell Grant how to steer the ship of state. And that's Horace Greeley sitting in front of Grant, blocking his view. This is Grant trying to feed civil reform to Carl Schurz there, and Charles Sumner and these other liberal Republicans. But this is more what Nass was doing. This is Grant trying to overcome all the scandals that he was involved in, acting like he had solved them all, and now he's free to lead the country as he chooses, and all the scandals were just a whole lot of nothing. In fact, in one of the scandals, Alexander Shepard, Grant was trying to defend him. Grant's biggest problem was that he stayed loyal to his friends, and even though he might have known that they did poorly and they screwed up and they were bribed, he still stuck by him. This is Columbia, representing the United States, telling Grant, quit fooling around with these bums that just make you look bad, don't defend them. And this is a fox trying to put the head of a scapegoat on Grant the lion. And you can see the Democratic jackass donkey over here underneath the chair lurking around. And then Nass did this beautiful piece here when Grant died. And this is Nass as an old man. Things didn't end well. After those 2 elections, he really didn't have anything to go after. He needed a target, and there were no more targets. Grant was out of the picture, sort of. And so he kind of lost his bearing a little bit. He lost a tremendous amount of his fortune to the Grant and Ward scandal that bankrupted Ulysses S. Grant and his son. So he lost over $30,000 in those days to that. Newspapers were being more feature-ish and not as hard-hitting editorials as Grant wanted to do. He tried a couple of failed newspapers on his own, and that didn't work out. And then toward the end of his life in 1903, he was just flat broke, and he still had to support a family. He was friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and he basically said, Teddy, can you do anything for me? And there was an opening for a U.S. consulate in Ecuador. That's the only job he could give him. So Nass on his own went down to Ecuador to represent the U.S., caught yellow fever, and died after about 1.5 years down there. Kind of a sad ending. Now, this is our next guy. This is Joseph Kepler, Keppler. He also was an immigrant. He came from Vienna, Austria. He came in 1867 here to Missouri, and he couldn't speak English either. But his father had been over here a few years, and he learned the language. All those line drawings you saw of Nass did them on pencil. They were transferred to a wood block, and an engraver actually had to engrave all the negative spaces out of those drawings. This is the way that Kepler worked at first, but he came up with another new revolutionary way to present artwork. In a minute here, I'll show you. So he came to St. Louis. He came actually to southern Missouri. The family moved to St. Louis, and Kepler was going to become a medical student at WashU, I think. But that failed. But he did try to start his own magazine, his own political newspaper in St. Louis. It was called Puck, P-U-C-K, in answer to the English Punch version of humor. This is kind of like the first really humor magazine that we know about. So this shows you where his loyalties lay. This is a drawing here. At the top is the triumphant return of U.S. Grant to St. Louis. There's nobody there to welcome him except one little guy and a dog. When Carl Schurz comes, the whole city of St. Louis turns out for him. And this is what Kepler thought of all this going on. So this is Nass trying to spray junk all over Carl Schurz. So clearly, Kepler thought the world of Schurz, hated his fellow cartoonist Nass for doing this, and Nass worked for Harper's Weekly. So in the upper right-hand corner is Grant paying off a prostitute dressed as Harper's Weekly. And about the time that Kepler came to St. Louis, there was another Civil War veteran that came to St. Louis. He was a Hungarian immigrant. He served in an all-German-speaking cavalry unit in New York. He got out of the service in 1865, had flat broke, took a train to St. Louis with the last pennies he had, and did everything from bury cholera victims to survey land. And he finally caught on in St. Louis, and he couldn't speak English either. He could speak Hungarian and German. But at the Mercantile Library downtown, there's all this German intelligentsia that were playing chess, and this guy was a great chess player. So he fell in that, and he was befriended by Carl Schurz. And he took him under his wing, and Schurz owned a newspaper called the Westlicke Post. He hired this guy. This is Joseph Pulitzer. So this is Joseph Pulitzer the first, as a young man, a very young man. And of course, later he bought the New York World, became world famous, reinvented modern journalism. His estate left millions to Columbia University in New York City to found a school of journalism and create the seed money for the Pulitzer Prizes. So he and Kepler were bumming around together in St. Louis in the late 1860s, 1870s. In fact, this is one of the many caricatures that Kepler did of Pulitzer while they were both in St. Louis. And this was for a sister publication of Puck in St. Louis called Unserblatt. And this is, Kepler drew Schurz down here, and that's actually supposed to be B. Gratz Brown, and then Charles Sumner. So the idea on this is Grant is sleeping, and he's dreaming about him being an emperor, and everyone currying favor with him and presenting gifts. And Schurz and his bunch are going to wake him up and bring him back to reality. And this is Carl Schurz flicking the little mouse of U.S. Grant off the table. So eventually, Kepler realized he was struggling financially, so he submitted some drawings to Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. So he first started working for them, and then he moved, he forgot about Puck, and he moved to New York City with his family, and he started working at Leslie's. So as I mentioned before, Grant's fault was he stuck too close to his friends even when they were wrong. So this is one of Kepler's drawing, and Grant is mollycoddling, and I think this is Belknap, center of one of the scandals. He's, holding him like a child and say, "Don't worry about things." This is another one of Kepler's, showing Grant as a drunken Napoleon, letting power go to his head. Another drunken Grant Napoleon type. And this is Grant ignoring all these scandals. Belknap is at the top there. And U.S. Sam, dressed as a policeman, says, "Are you going to do anything about this, President Grant?" So this was the debate among a lot of political cartoonists at the time. This is really business. This is Grant throttling justice, symbol of justice. So, like I say, there's plenty of junk going on back there to equal what we're going through now.
Do you think there's any significance to how heavy Grant is in these pictures?
It's a good question. He does look about 20 pounds heavier than what we used to see in the photographs, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Well, Kepler didn't like him, so maybe he gave him a few more pounds.
Make it look heavy.
Yeah. So Kepler couldn't make Puck work, even in a German language, which at first was an English language version in St. Louis. He went to New York, worked for Leslie's, and he started Puck again in New York City. So Puck is named after the famous Shakespeare character in Midsummer Night's Dream. And favorite saying, "Oh, what fools these mortals be." And so that was sort of Kepler's personal credo. In fact, the building for Puck is still in New York City. It's a National Historic Landmark. And there's the Puck statue still standing, welcoming people. So this is probably Kepler's most famous anti-Grant cartoon. And it's all about Grant is barely holding on to dear life. It's the whiskey ring up in his right hand. And these are all the people that have been involved in all the scandals that he stuck up for. So he's barely hanging on, trying to support all this scandal and going on in his administration. This is probably one of Kepler's most reproduced cartoons. And you'll notice how nice the color looks on this. And that's because Kepler figured out a way to do away with the old woodcut engravings. And he did color lithography, where you actually draw on stone, and from that the print is made. So he figured out how to successfully and financially make these beautiful color things. So you can imagine if you were in New York then, you pulled this open, you would just be dazzled by how realistic and how nice the color is. This is from the archives at Whitehaven. These are all these worms crawling out of their holes going to Washington, D.C. And hopefully, I guess they're thinking they're going to be president. And then over in the right-hand corner is Grant as a worm. This is another one of Kepler's, saying there's too many people worshiping Grant for no good reason. And so he's the false idol, the golden calf on top of the statue there. And instead of Moses, Puck is up in the upper right-hand corner bringing down the Ten Commandments. And this is, that's Rutherford B. Hayes on the left. And the criticism here was that Rutherford B. Hayes was doing all the heavy work trying to keep the Republican Party going. Grant and Senator Conklin from New York were kind of taking all the credit. So this is a Cinderella story. This is Cinderella at home of Hayes, and this is Conklin and Grant, the evil stepsisters, taking all the credit for keeping things going. And that's Grant dressed as an evil stepsister with a beauty mark and everything. And here's when Grant retired after the second term, he was going to go in on some canal, construction company. But here he's got directing the construction crew. These are all well-known politicians, but as you can see in the posts that wind up to the upper right-hand corner, it says third term. So a lot of controversy then. Grant had already served 2 terms, and a lot of people thought he should serve a third, and a lot of people thought that 3 terms is too much. He'll be another Caesar. So he's directing people to his third term, although he was trying to be shy about it. These are some of his biggest supporters. That's Conklin in the middle, acting as a Salvation Army band, singing the praises of General Grant as he marches with a giant banner for a third term. And this is the publisher on the far right of Harper's Weekly. He wants civil reform. He acts like he's trying to build it. And Grant is a direct opposite. Remember, Grant was against Harper's Weekly and NAS. He's trying to paste over things on the left. And this is my favorite. This is going to the convention, which might have been Grant's third presidency. So these are all notable people. There's Conklin from New York at the engineers thing. So the train is running toward the convention site. And what I love about this is that Grant is the smokestack, puffing away. Kepler was just a beautiful artist. Here's Grant trying to put everyone to sleep. No, I'm not going to run for a third term. Don't worry about it. Cool your jets. These are all these other Republican politicians. So he's dressed up trying to fan them to sleep, to lull them into not thinking that he might run for a third term. And finally, when he lost to Garfield at the convention, he turned over his sword like Appomattox. And these are some other artists that work for Kepler. Kepler oversaw everything. He employed a tremendous staff of really talented people. So these are all different artists, but they all ran under the tutelage of Kepler. And on the far left, you can see Grant is a little crybaby, not getting what he wanted. And there he is, kicking over his own, spotless reputation, prior to all these political scandals. He's destroying his old statue by how foolish he was. Grant as his own iconoclast. And this is Grant, who looks a little south there, got a red nose, and I think he's trying to convince Chester Arthur, the president, to hire some of these old crooked cronies of his for Arthur's administration. And this is beautifully drawn. The guy in the middle with the sword is General Logan, Civil War. He was caught in one of the scandals. And he's trying to get to the Capitol, and the people holding him up are these Republicans. He's walking on the backs of them. They're holding his popularity together. And you can see General Grant down here is a monkey. Grant is a baby eating his pablum, and Chester Conklin, the New York senator, feeding it to him. But even Kepler realized that Grant was probably the most famous American in the whole world and still beloved. Despite the scandals, he was still much beloved among many, many Americans. So Kepler wasn't total fool. When he died, he did this beautifully rendered memorial to Grant. And of course, that's Grant's famous saying, "Let us have peace." Beautifully done. And also Kepler did this as a memorial to Grant after he died. And this is a self-portrait of Kepler. So Kepler supposed, what would happen if I were to fall asleep and I couldn't draw all these great anti-politician, anti-Grant cartoons? So that's Kepler on a hammock, asleep in his studio. And here is Grant right here with a red nose and a cigar, painting himself as a grand emperor. And things didn't end well for Kepler either. He had this ambitious idea to take his entire printing operation, the entire magazine staff, to the 1893 Columbia Exposition in Chicago. So he was putting out a daily paper in Chicago in front of thousands of people and working his tail off. When he was done with this, he went back to New York, and he died of exhaustion. So it was 1894 was when he died. So not a good ending for either one of these fellows, unfortunately. Now, I've even tried some drawings of Grant. I get to pick what the Weatherford gets to comment about, because I picked from the news budget. And so if there's anything about Grant or Civil War or my local history and Crestwood and Grantwood, I always try to choose that story. So this is before color. This is a scan from the original black and white pen and ink, and I don't remember what the bird line was or even what the subject was, but it was Grant saluting the weatherbird. And that's when Whitehaven started as a group called Save Whitehaven to save Whitehaven. One of the main supporters was the sister-in-law of a copy editor friend of mine. So any Grant drawings I would do, she would want the original to auction off to raise funds for Whitehaven. And that's 1988. There's Grant in uniform as the weatherbird, smoking a cigar, of course. And when I spoke to Whitehaven Bunch 12 years ago, I did this drawing for them. And much to my surprise, when I was digging around the archives for this talk, they still had it. So they scanned it and gave it back to me. Not the drawing, but the scan. So that's the weatherbird and Ulysses. And this is the weatherbird when there was a brief period when the Park Service was contemplating taking over Grant's farm. It didn't last very long, but that was something they were considering. So I thought, here's a National Park Service ranger eyeing a Budweiser. And then for 20 years, I did a political comic strip for the op-ed pages. And actually, the last 20 years of my career, I was permanently detached from the art department to the editorial page. So I did hundreds of drawings, political drawings, illustrating columns and things like that, not the formal editorial cartoonist. But I did draw this for the op-ed for 20 years called Postcard from Mountain City. So when Grant's birthday came along, I had to do this. So panel one is Grant endured endless pigeon dive bobbings while posing for a statue in front of City Hall. And the sculptor saying, "Hold still, Mr. Grant." Or he was riding on Grant's Trail, which runs near my house. And then he dang near drowned in Gravois Creek once. And Grant saying, "If you think I'm in trouble, you should see my horse." And then down at the bottom there, he was the very first towel boy at General Grant Car Wash. And General Grant's asking for air freshener, would you like lemon, pine, or old cigar scent? And then a developer wanted to turn Whitehaven into an amusement park, and that's a robotic Grant saying, "Welcome to Six Flags over Afton, boys and girls." So which ones of these are false, totally false? Well, there really was a guy who was going to try to turn Whitehaven into an amusement park at one time, out of Kansas City. And Grant really did almost drown in the Gravois Creek during flood when he was seeing Julia Denton, his bride. So I think it's safe to say that I'm as talented an artist and as famous as Nast and Kepler. Would you say that?
Yeah.
This is your cue to laugh.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not. But My cartoons are just as absorbent as those two guys are. Okay, questions?
Did Grant ever respond to Kepler's cartoon?
I don't think so. He wasn't a thin-skinned kind of guy, but he really knew how important Nast was to his success. Nast was a regular visitor to the White House. Grant even visited Nast's home in Morristown, New Jersey. The reason he was in Morristown, New Jersey was because death threats from the Tammany Hall ring forced him to leave New York City and move to New Jersey. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, when these artists did those drawings, did they have to do them in a standard size if they were going to be placed in any of the syndicated newspapers? Did they have to constrain themselves to size?
Kind of yes and no. The big Nast drawings on a wood block, where it's actually engraved out of a wood block. If it was a big drawing, they had to draw it and they had to engrave it in sections and combine it together to make the same size. Now, virtually all drawings for publications to this day are done larger than what you see in publication. The bird, appears like this in the newspaper, but I'm drawing it about like that. On the color lithography that Kepler was doing, he was doing most of those same size because it was coming right off the stone. But that's what makes his drawings even that much more amazing. Anybody here under 50 that knows what a newspaper is?
Well, no.
Yeah, Gary.
So who was your favorite artist that you talked about?
Of these two?
Of the other three you talked about?
Of three? Well, I'm my favorite artist, yeah.
You're your favorite artist?
I really have to, I admire Kepler's draftsmanship the most, because he was doing these beautiful blended color drawings, very, very difficult stone lithography. But Nast was the harder-hitting editorial cartoonist. The difference was that Nast lived through the Civil War and knew how important Grant and Lincoln were, whereas when the Civil War was going on, Kepler was still over in Austria. So he couldn't quite appreciate the sacrifice of the country and what a big deal Lincoln and so he was more of a satirist than a hard-hitting editorial cartoonist. So if I could combine the two, I would be happy. Questions about the Post-Dispatch, the Weather Bird? Your salad tonight? Yes.
Kind of off the subject.
Sure.
But do you know what the deal was with Lee, Grant, and Caledonia?
Caledonia, Missouri? I don't know.
You should look into it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I didn't know Lee was ever in Missouri.
Check it out.
Okay.
That's it.
All right, now I'm going to Google that as soon as I get out of here.
That's it. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Do you know exactly the scandals about Grant? What they were?
There were about 12 big scams. Some were bigger than others. I mean, if you Google it, you just can't believe all the corruption and bribery was going on. The biggest one probably was called the Whiskey Ring. That's where Treasury officials were bribed by distillers not to pay tax to clear up the paperwork. And that was all centered around St. Louis. The trial was in St. Louis here, and that might have been the worst one. The Whiskey Ring. And there were a series of others, most of them involving bribery and kickbacks. And almost to the person, Grant would defend whatever buddy of his was involved with it.
Did the railroad have a lot to do with their kickbacks?
It might have been one of the scandals, but I'm not sure.
There's a lot of things going on.
Oh, yeah.
In Nashville, they still have the Whiskey Jam to this day.
In honor of the Whiskey Ring?
I don't
scandal?
know, but you should check it out. This is all to say.
All right, that's two things I'm going to Google
You
then.
bet.
The Post-Dispatch has been around since 1878. 20 years ago, up until 20 years ago, we were still owned by the Pulitzer family. And Joseph Pulitzer came out of St. Louis. he had 3 sons. The 2 favorite sons stayed in New York to run the gigantic, famous New York World. And he sent the dumb one, Joseph Pulitzer II, out to the sticks here in St. Louis. It turns out those 2 kids ran the New York World into the ground. Joseph Pulitzer II in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch made it world famous, won multiple Pulitzer Prizes. But there was no favoritism in Pulitzer Prizes, believe it or not. And he became a success. His son took it over, and I was hired under his regime. I didn't know him well, but I knew him, and I still know his widow in St. Louis. And then his son, Joseph Pulitzer IV, was a friend. And then Joseph Pulitzer V is on a ranch somewhere in Sheridan, Wyoming, counting his money. So I knew the last 2 Pulitzers, but they all got started here in St. Louis.
What's the political cartooning world like right now? I mean, I was a design major, loved cartooning. Mike Peters was always a favorite.
Sure.
Are you involved in like some kind of, are there organizations for editorial cartoonists?
There's 2 groups. There's the American Association of Editorial Cartoonists, which that means you have to be a full-time working cartoonist for a daily newspaper or a daily website now. And they're down to about 50 or less in the entire country. The other organization is the National Cartoonist Society that I'm a member of that's surprisingly tough to get into. And we're doing a little better, but not by much. As newspaper circulation goes down, syndicated comic strip cartoonists, their revenue goes down too. A cartoonist normally splits the revenue between 50 for him and 50 for the syndicate, the syndicates and stuff. And so no one is really doing great. More and more cartoonists are migrating toward online stuff strictly. You mentioned Mike Peters. Everyone here remembers Charlotte Peters on TV. Well, Mike is Charlotte's little boy, Mikey, who was on the TV show sometime. And Mike and I have known each other for 45 years. He wrote an intro to a book for me, and he's just been a great guy. He was the Grand Marshal of the Lord Mardi Gras parade once. Bill McClellan and I were 2 of the judges, and I don't remember anything from that day. The short answer is, it's dire. In fact, 10 years ago, the Post-Dispatch formally eliminated its full-time editorial cartoonist. And so they would just run syndicate stuff. For a while, I was the one that was picking the syndicated cartoons. Another great cartoonist for the Post-Dispatch was Bill Malden. Has everyone known that name? Willie and Joe cartoons from World War II. Bill was the cartoonist from the late 50s to early 60s and won a Pulitzer Prize for the Post-Dispatch in 1959. And I got to meet him once, one of the thrills. Yes, Gary?
So is there some significance when you put 6 flags on that one cartoon?
I worked at Six Flags and I still have nightmares about it.
Tell them what you did there.
I was a caricature artist, so the tourists would sit down, they would either get their portrait drawn to make them look like them, or they would get their caricature done where I could make fun of them. So I did that for 2.5 summers. Anytime I smell hot asphalt mixed with wet cotton candy, I kind of have a triggered effect. That's how I got through college, high school. Any other questions? Well, that's it. Thank you for staying awake. I appreciate it. Thank you.